So first, I want to thank the three of you for three wonderful presentations. Thank you so much for your work in putting that together, and thank you for your work in support of our families and in support of good science. I think for many of our families, what's happening in Washington feels very abstract, especially for families who have younger children or children with profound autism who are requiring intensive care and support, usually from the parents. So can each of you maybe talk a little bit in concrete terms about how what is happening in Washington, D.C. is going to have a direct effect on our families?
Are you thinking specifically research or broader than that?
How research and policy will affect our families' access to care and to services, and why our families should be focused on what is happening in Washington, D.C.
Let me start with the broader policy picture, and then maybe we can talk about the longer-term impact on that arises from the research concerns. So when we talk about, if the federal IACC is going to meet, and if it does meet, what are they going to focus on? You have to remember that it's not just about identifying areas of research. Sitting on the Federal Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee is a representative from the Department of Labor, from the Department of Education, from the Agency for Community Living, for a whole range of federal agencies that set policy and that fund efforts and interact with the states and localities that provide care to individuals and families with autism. They set the rules around supported housing. They set standards for appropriate care, whether we're talking about delivery through the education system or the healthcare system. And the IACC is one of really a very few ways for the autism community to be able to speak directly to those representatives and raise those concerns. And over the 8 years that I chaired that group, I heard from families about the lack of housing. I heard from families about the challenges that varied from locality to locality, getting services for their preschool-age children, early intervention and the like. But I didn't only hear it as the head of the research organization. These other representatives did, and they brought it back to their agencies. They brought it back to their secretaries for their different departments. And these things work slowly, and they take time, but they do affect these kinds of policies. And so that's one example. I would say the second thing is that when the Secretary of Health and Human Services, which oversees quite a lot of what I just talked about, focuses on something, that something it gets done, and that something might be increasing services, it might be allowing Medicaid to pay for supported housing, which is experiments that were ongoing. Well, guess what? Health and Human Services now has decided that they're not going to do that anymore. They're not going to allow, and I think this is a subject of a court case, but they're not going to allow the use of Medicaid funds to go for supported housing anymore. And so that's going to directly affect the admittedly too small number of families who have been relying on that for their older children with autism. So these policy decisions by these policymakers have real-world impacts, both in terms of setting standards and negotiating with the states with what they do, and also in terms of ensuring the continuity of experiments and programs that we think one day might make things more widely available to others.
So I'm thinking in terms of what kinds of impacts have we seen over the last year, and particularly the impact on younger families, okay? There are many families, this is new for them, and they see in September 2025 that the President of the United States, accompanied by the Secretary of Health and Human Services, announces that Tylenol could be or is a risk factor for autism, although they didn't put it quite so eloquently. They said it could cause autism. A recent letter to The Lancet by emergency room physicians who monitored electronic health records showed that immediately after that announcement, the number of women in the pregnancy bearing years, the age range, that were not going to take Tylenol. I received 3 or 4 phone calls from colleagues who had, younger colleagues, who had pregnant wives. And these were scientists, these are my friends. And they're calling me to say, should we be worried about Tylenol? All the clinicians, we have many clinician scientists in the coalition, they have been frantic over the last 9 months or so, handling concerns from parents. It's understandable. You see the leaders of our country announcing that leucovorin could be, this is the cure for autism, and they're being inundated by requests to put their children on leucovorin, even though there is no evidence, as the FDA has recently announced. So there were these real-world impacts, and, you know, parents of older children with autism, they're sort of used to the kind of miracle cures and the announcements about this causes, and they've learned over the years not to be concerned, you know, not to get too worked up about it. But if you are a young mother and you've just heard your child was diagnosed with autism, it's not surprising to me that you would take this seriously. They haven't immersed themselves in the way we're immersing ourselves here today. So it really does matter. Words matter. Advice matters. And what we need to be concerned about is that the words and advice on autism are based in scientific evidence.
Yeah, I think, David, before you respond, I 100% agree, and I think that's also why the issue of studying vaccines, continuing to study vaccines, is such a critical issue. People ask me all the time, why would it be so bad to do more studies on vaccines? It's really about the new parents who have not spent the last 20 years immersed in the 20 years of science looking at vaccines and autism, all of which exonerate vaccines as a cause of autism. They hear the government is going to study whether vaccines cause autism, and they think, oh, well, I'll wait then. I'll wait until we know whether vaccines cause autism before I vaccinate my child. And then they leave their children exposed to vaccine-preventable disease. So I think that's an incredibly important point. David?
Yeah, I'd also add that every dollar that's spent on vaccine research is a dollar that's not spent on something that could be more helpful to families. So I'll give 3 really quick examples. The first is the 2 single largest payers for autism services in the United States are Medicaid and special education. Medicaid is a federal program that's administered by states, and how the feds decide to appropriate money has huge impact for what services autistic people are able to access in their communities. For special education services, that's a federal entitlement for children with disabilities that is underfunded. Congress has never appropriated more than 40 cents on the dollar of what they said they would for special education services. So many states are looking for ways to get out of that mandate, which is why the Department of Education has a civil rights division. That civil rights division is there to fight for our children, to make sure that they get the services to which they're entitled. Under the Trump administration, the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Education has been absolutely decimated. It has not prosecuted a single case this year. And so there are both immediate and long-term effects of that. The second example I will give is, where do families turn when conventional treatments have failed them? They turn to clinical trials. If the NIH is not funding clinical trials, there are no clinical trials for you to turn to. Right? So it means that your access to rigorous, ethically conducted experiments that might help autistic people is severely limited. And the third area is that the current funding landscape has had a chilling effect on universities and their willingness to fund PhD students. Those PhD students are the clinical psychologists, occupational therapists, speech therapists that serve our children. So we are training fewer of them now than we were just a few years ago. And that, again, is going to have both short-term and long-term effects on the field.
Thank you. One of the questions we had earlier from the audience was about the wide range of differing opinions in the autism community. I think one of the areas where there's always been difference of opinion is, should we focus more on funding for basic science to understand the causes of autism and to develop interventions that are based on the underlying biology, or should we focus more on practical types of research, understanding the best types of services and implementation research? So we have, I think, a difference of opinion on this panel. So how well, when you look at the current funding landscape, how well are we addressing basic science and service and implementation science?
So first of all, I would like to point out that we are operating from an absolute scarcity mentality, right? The idea that there's not enough money to fund both is an issue of values. It's not an issue of purse, right? And so the first thing is, we should not be fighting amongst ourselves. We should be fighting together to increase funding for research across the translational continuum. The second thing I will say is that NIH research traditionally has more focused on the left side of the translational continuum than the right. We have a lot of focus on basic science, we have a lot of focus on preclinical science, and we have some focus on actual efficacy testing of different interventions. When you go into the community to try and get those interventions, you can't find them, right? And you can't find them because we haven't done tests of what the service system should look like, and what strategies should be to bring those treatments to scale, or often they're developed in a way that they absolutely cannot be brought to scale, given the current structure of our system. So different than what we talked about before, I will take a yes and approach, right? That like, if you're doing preclinical work or you're doing intervention studies, you should be partnering with the people down the translational continuum who you ultimately hope will use what you find to make life better for autistic people and their caregivers. I would love to see like such a longer lens, more foresight in how we think about that continuum of research happening.
I'm going to agree with you wholeheartedly, right? And I'm a basic scientist. I study mice, right? And I think that's the exact kind of thing we need. We definitely need more funds overall. I'll even agree with you that we've underfunded the right-hand side of the spectrum relative to the left. I'll still strongly argue we still need that left side. And then I will say that getting people to talk across that spectrum is really important. And there are some really wonderful examples of that, right? Certainly some of the foundations here have been encouraging that. Your own work where you need to have people from multiple ends of the data spectrum is really important. In our department, we just are about to, on next week at Columbia, launch a new structure where we're going to have programs that faculty be required to participate in, where basic scientists are going to work along with clinicians and translational scientists and implementation scientists and services researchers, by fields, to try to make sure that they're talking to each other and to create collaborations. And we're putting money into that at the departmental level. So I think, yeah, wholeheartedly agree.
So if you remember, you won't, but Josh presented a graph on the distribution of where the autism science dollars are going. And by far the largest was a category called biology. Well, when I sat on the IACC and began to look into that, I realized all my grants were actually there. I wondered, where was I in terms of the work that I do, particularly on infants and development and looking at language? And it turns out those are classified as biology. So I think there's sometimes a misunderstanding of, how we're classifying things. One of the things we have learned from the baby sibling research, and thank you again to the Autism Science Foundation for supporting our consortium, which has been absolutely crucial in keeping us going. One of the things we're learning is that when we look at development of infants from birth through ages 8 and 9, behavioral development, cognitive development, brain development, these are dynamic processes. You can't take a slice of time, look at a child, and think you know everything about them. It's really about those developmental trajectories and the range of those trajectories that we've learned so much about. That's the biology. Well, knowing that development, and especially brain development, and I think we're just beginning to see very exciting new models of understanding what the brain is really about, how it really functions, and what's critical to early development. By understanding those developmental trajectories, that's really going to inform us on issues related to early identification, to early intervention, to developmental interventions over the course of the lifespan. So I think biology has some immediate impacts. We can get away from the gene therapy. There's a lot between the genes and the gene therapies and the sort of mindless behavioral therapies that don't focus on contact, to think in this kind of developmental framework. And that's all emerged from what's now called biological studies of autism.
So I'm going to ask one more question and then we'll open it up to the floor. But I mean, one area that we've been very concerned about is really the unequal burden of how the cuts are affecting early career researchers. We have many early career researchers joining us today. We just lost an early career researcher in a study that we were looking forward to funding because he left. How do we think that the changes in the federal funding landscape are going to affect our earlier career researchers? And are we going to have a big hole in our work pipeline that in the long run is going to make it impossible for us to continue to make progress in research?
I had a bizarre experience. Because the job market is so bad right now, I had an overwhelming number of applicants for our doctoral training programs and our postdoctoral training programs this year, and we could take so few people, and they are in survival mode, right? This has had such a chilling. They're in survival mode. Those who are electing to stay in academia, right? So I had doctoral students and postdocs who had grants administratively withdrawn because they were studying health disparities. I had some who were told that their grants were going to be funded and are still waiting 9 months later to get official word and a check. I have one brilliant clinical psychologist who said, screw this. I'm going up to hang out a shingle and I'm going to make twice as much in private practice as I would in academia. And the research they're doing, they're thinking not about what is the next important question that I could ask that would advance the field or advance care. It's what can I ask that will get funded, right? And so it has completely changed for the next 1,031 days, they are going to be focused on, salary support and some data so I could publish, and not what is going to make life better for autistic people and their families.
I think the situation is dire. I think there's a lot of risk. I think our early career scientists see that risk, and it is discouraging to them. And there are no question we're going to lose people We have already lost people, as you just heard David say, and we are going to lose more. I think the long-term outlook, though, really depends upon what happens during those next 1,000 days. Not so, yes, of course, what happens after this administration, assuming there will be an end to it. What happens after this administration matters a lot, but what happens during the next 1,000 days in terms of what Congress does, what you all do, what we all do together, whether it's ASF stepping up and funding some postdocs, that's amazing, whether it's us getting our congressional representatives to insist on maintaining the NIH budget, and even more importantly, insisting on maintaining scientific control over the decision-making process, which is unfortunately not current, right? The politicians have the last say right now in what grants are being funded at NIH. And so I think if we can push back and we can establish, then at least those folks who are willing to wait out 1,000 days, at least those folks who are willing to nonetheless, despite these obstacles, to try to succeed, at least they can have hope that the scientific community is going to remain well supported by the American public. And I think if you look at polls, if you look at Congress, there is that support there. But we need to rally them, we need to remind them that we as citizens of this country care about science, we care about the next generation of scientists and practitioners who are going to help our children. If we can get that message across and that message can then be enforced through congressional action, then there's a lot of hope that, yes, we're losing people now, but we're going to maintain ourselves in the long run.
So I just have two things to add to your comments. One is that I want to go back to David's shout out to the folks at NIH. They're the ones responsible for pulling grants and making sure that people are getting funded. And this is anecdotal, not scientific evidence, but my sense that I'm feeling is that they're doing their best to pull out of the hopper of well-reviewed grants. They're doing their best to support the early career scientists. So I'm always optimistic. However, I think where we need to keep our eye on NIH in terms of the pipeline is what are they doing with the training grants. That's a crucial mechanism at both the pre and the postdoctoral level immediately. And I think we need to back off from this fight between the federal government and our universities. That's why places like Boston University have drastically cut doctoral student admissions. They are petrified about what's going to happen in the broader landscape of academia and the federal government, and that's what we need to be supporting, because amazing and wonderful the efforts of all the foundations today to focus on early career scientists. You can't do it all, okay? We need the federal government, and so that's where we need to be focusing our attention.
So I said I was going to open it to questions, but I'm going to ask a follow-up question about that, because it's something that I've been thinking a lot about since our independent autism coordinating committee met, which is we saw data at that meeting that showed that the percentage of autism research being funded by the private sector has gone up from 17% in 2020 to 40% in 2025. And while that is wonderful that the Simons Foundation and ARIA and private industry is now embracing the autism community and autism research, there was a wonderful presentation by Dr. Tom Insel at our meeting about the interest of venture capital in getting involved in autism research. But are we, by doing that, telling the federal government we no longer need you, when we in fact do, when it is our right as citizens who pay taxes to have our federal government funding research that improves the lives of our families. How do we balance that change?
You know, I said in my talk that it's a wonderful news that organizations like ARIA are entering the fray, that Simons continues to support and expanding support for autism research, that ASF and all the other players in the field are doing it, and that number is growing. That is good news, right? What is not good news is that the NIH budget has basically stagnated the last 2 years, and that it's under threat for cuts. So I'll use the yes and, David, and say that that's wonderful, and we need to continue to push for continued federal investment, right? Depending upon, you know, which year the federal IACC you're listening to, we're either underfunding federal research overall by a quarter to a half, right? And so we need that continued investment. And, you know, the point was made, even with these massive private sector investments, unprecedented private sector investments, the federal government is still, and the stagnation on the federal side, the federal government is still the major funder. And I'll just say one more thing, if you think internationally even more, right? The NIH is not just the largest funder of research in the US, it's the largest funder of research worldwide, and it is not even close. It is almost an order of magnitude more than any other scientific agency in the international space. So I think we lose as a globe if the NIH doesn't continue to invest in autism research.
I want to point out one important difference between NIH funding or government funding in general and private foundation funding. And that is that NIH funding comes with support to the academic institution with respect to infrastructure, okay? Whatever people want to call that, but with the understanding that for universities to support a center like mine, there's a lot of infrastructure that needs to be poured into it too. The private foundations cannot pick that up, and therefore we will continue to always need the NIH. There are some institutions who used to not even allow early career or even senior scientists to apply for foundation grants because they didn't bring some of this infrastructure support with them. I hope that's changing now, but still, we need the NIH because the government, the public, has a vested interest in supporting the academic foundation for research that eventually finds its way into therapies, into services, and so forth.
That was good. I got nothing to add.
Then we'll open it up to questions from anyone who's here. Oh, my mom has a question. See, that's where I get it from.
I'm Rita Teber, Allison's mom. I want to follow up and pursue this notion that the pipeline of future scientists is drying up. But I want to go even further back than the doctoral level. Students in high school were told just a few years back to pursue STEM, that this was a great career to go into. And now that's not happening. I mean, they're hearing that when you get to college, the labs are not going to be funding you to do research. And I think students are not encouraged to pursue this. Now, Allison, I know you give grants to undergraduate students, and that's great, but are there other things, ways of communicating with students at a very young age, you know, the high school graduate, the young undergraduate, to tell them that there may still be a future for them in science?
There are, and those are under threat. In fact, just a few examples. So the Society for Neuroscience has a program, or had a program, where they funded undergraduate neuroscience students, engaged them in research opportunities, and followed them with funding through the transition into graduate school. That program was targeted at individuals underrepresented in neuroscience. That program was terminated by the NIH under this administration. There are many places, including Columbia, that had summer undergraduate research programs that were similarly targeted, some of them that were funded by the federal government and they were terminated, but others that we were forced to terminate because of legal claims that that was illegal discrimination. And others which are which are attempting to revive without the funding, to more globally support undergraduate participation. So I think there are certainly many of these programs that continue, and we can look to ways that we can enhance them. But those are those that either rely on federal funding or that target communities that are underrepresented in science to try to enrich the diversity of scientists. They've been under direct threat because of actions taken by this administration.
When I was in high school, I wanted to be an actor. My Depression-era dad said, get a job first. Right? Did you know there's a job now called prompt engineer? You can make as much as $300,000 a year, like translating a question from someone who wants to ask AI that question into something that will give them their answer. There are job opportunities now and ways that we are thinking about incorporating science into our daily lives that I could not have dreamed of in high school. And it is distressing to me that we are suggesting to high school students that they should make career choices based on the current economic environment, about which will change. Not only will it change, but the technology underlying it will change. I also say that most people who get a STEM degree do not go into academia. They go into industry, So there are lots of reasons, I think, to encourage high school students to pursue what they love, if it's not acting, according to my dad. Knowing that it is very difficult to anticipate what the environment will be and that they will likely have to pivot. And at the same time, yes, we should be absolutely supporting the development financially of a workforce in this area. It is relatively inexpensive to do, the younger the person is that you are supporting, and this would be, I think, a great place for private philanthropy, like the Autism Science Foundation has done to fill that gap.
I think the autism community owes a debt of gratitude to your father.
So I'll just say my granddaughter is organizing me to come and speak to her high school. She's hoping I will come. And she wants me to talk about various parts of my work. But as a result of your wonderful question, I am going to make sure to tell all these high school students that the important thing to do is to follow your dream and to do what you want and not to pay attention, as you said, to these economic and advice that other people give. Because if people have a passion to go into research on autism, and I get contacted by high school students a great deal. They want to come and spend time in my lab and know what I do and come to Boston University. That's our job, is to encourage people to follow their dream. They will do the very best work that we can hope for in the future.
So we'll take one more question before we wrap up. I see one in the way back.
Thank you very much for all of your comments. They've been really interesting. But one contradiction stood out in my mind, which was the research on the different genetic sources that lead to manifestations of either autism or related behaviors or what conditions. That I would have loved to hear a lot more about, and I think would be very interesting for the general public as well, because I guess many of the parents who have children with autism might wonder, is it worth doing a new test to see whether there's new information that can still be pulled out to impact how we approach the rest of their life. So that's one thing. But then the problem with information privacy in genetics is also a ghost that haunts us, because one company closed because it was going to sell all of its data on ancestry, and what we don't want is all of our genetic information somewhere, which then the federal government can come and pick apart and say, well, you're excluded from life because you have this or that. So I just love to hear how you see those two things being part of the future of research into autism.
So before I let Josh answer, I'm going to say thank you for teeing up our afternoon session so perfectly. We're going to hear exactly on those two topics about advances in genetics and genetic medicines, as well as issues around privacy and registries. So
That's what I was going to say. Stay tuned. I think you're going to get, and ask your question again in that panel this afternoon, because there's some really wonderful experts on those exact issues.
So with that, I will thank our panelists. Thank you very much.